Welcome to today's episode and the topic of transactional analysis as an open and globally available method. If you want to listen to that episode on another platform, please follow the link in the description. We're going to look at questions like, what is transactional analysis? How is it benefiting your life? Why is it important to make it available globally? And much more. For the conversation, I invited Julie Hay. She wrote plenty of books, and my personal favorite and first book of hers was the one with transactional analysis for trainers, so I could start my training career. And for me, it's an honor to have her here. She works in the field of transactional analysis for over 40 years now. And now she also have a new and free series published of books that I, of course, also link in the description. For all other things and all other links and organizations she coordinated and also brought into existence, you find a link in the description. If you want to jump around in the session, please do freely so and use the timestamps that are provided for that. Thank you very much for your time and a warm welcome to you, Julie Hay.
Hi, Dagmar. And I was thinking as I heard you introducing me, I have to admit it's nearly 50 years.
It's nearly 50, wow.
In a couple of years, it will be 50 years.
Mm-hmm. So a great anniversary already.
Yeah. Yeah, and I remember you said something about how did I get involved?
Mm-hmm.
And I remember I was working for a major airline, a UK major airline, and somebody in a different training department was talking to me about what I was doing. I was trained in something called behavior analysis.
Mm-hmm.
And he actually said he preferred transactional analysis. And I said, what's that?
Yeah.
And he lent me a couple of books to read. And I never looked back. I thought, this is amazing.
Yeah. Nice. Which were the first books you read about TA?
I think one of them, I probably wouldn't necessarily recommend them nowadays, but one was I'm Okay, You're Okay.
I also don't
Thomas
like the
Harris.
book. Yeah.
And the other one, I forget the name of it. It was a more obscure book, but it was more about it started me off, and then I started learning more about it. And got lots more books.
Yeah.
And I ended up doing the official professional training sponsored by the airline.
Oh, nice.
Which was fantastic because I tell people now, because I'm working internationally so much, to encourage people to accept online, I had to fly to another country once a month and spend a weekend there doing my training. Now, the other country was Scotland, so it's still in the UK. But I've got Scottish colleagues who will insist it's another country and they ought to be independent. And I couldn't have done it if I hadn't worked for an airline because I got a free flight and they paid for my hotel and they paid my fees.
Yeah.
So I'm very conscious about making TA available to people who can't afford to do that, which online does.
Yeah. And it's really a good thing. I love that you're doing that, and you did that already way before COVID. And it's just like the step up that people now are more aware of it and use it properly, because it's like, okay, they were forced for it for 2 years, and now they say, actually, it's a good thing to do it.
Yeah. So it's like every calamity has a benefit. It's like COVID was a serious problem for people.
Yeah.
But it means that far more people are now online than would have been without it.
Definitely.
And I still smile a lot when I hear some of my colleagues still talking about, when I was young, we didn't have phones. You know, I can remember when we first got a telephone in the house. And that was shared with neighbors. So you'd pick up the phone and they would be on it. And people used to say, why do we need a phone? What's wrong with a letter? And I now hear colleagues saying the same thing about when can we get back to meeting face to face?
Yeah.
And I'm thinking, why would you do that? Because so many people can't meet face to face. They're around the world, and even if they're in the same country, they can't necessarily afford to travel.
Yeah, exactly.
And I see it's bad for the environment. I feel a bit guilty because I've actually flown to and taught TA in over 40 different countries. And I'm thinking, oh dear, I never thought about how I was contributing to global warming. It was just wonderful to be able to do.
To travel and have that experience.
Yeah. So, but now I think, okay, but we have to stop doing that because we could travel online virtually.
Yeah.
And we can still see the sights and see the people.
Yeah, definitely.
It's not causing so much damage. Yeah.
And like you already said, it has a huge potential, like bringing people on that usually would not be able, not just because of the financial thing, but if you travel to certain borders where you're not allowed to travel to or anything else, and at least you have internet connection and you can learn whatever you want to learn is a huge ability of our time right now.
Yeah. And it's also great for cross-cultural work because my regular training in the English language has people coming together from several different countries.
Yeah.
So I'll have somebody who's in the USA, somebody in Iran, somebody who's Russian, somebody who's Russian in Russia, and somebody who's Russian not in Russia, China. So they all get to talk to each other. And I put them in breakout rooms randomly, and that's really good for people to understand that we're all people. Yeah. And it gets fascinating to consider that we need to do something about TA itself because it's very much based in California in the 1960s, in the hippie era. So we talk a lot about it's to develop autonomy, but autonomy tends to be described as you can do what you want and you ought to be able to choosing what you do. And that doesn't reflect that in some cultures, if you do that, you get killed.
Yeah.
So to me, autonomy is you need to take into account the context you're in and then choose how to behave. But it's fine if you choose to behave in a way that keeps you alive.
Definitely.
Yeah. Rather than being like a hippie and just thinking I'm supposed to show my feelings and tell everybody what I want. Yeah.
And it's a very big learning also, not just cultural wise, but also organizational wise. In which organization am I working? So I, of course, need to adapt to a certain degree of what is the cultural script of that organization. And I see that with my clients and my further education students as well, when they realize and learn TA, it's like, oh, I never thought about that. So a lot of things get activated for them that they never thought about before. And then they started training with me and it's like, okay, now I understand why I am doing that, but also why the organization or the culture is doing that as well.
Yeah, yeah. And then for me, it's about the process of having the understanding. So the TA models, like you say, give people the understanding about the dynamics they're existing within.
Yeah.
And then they can choose what they want to do about that. And they don't have to act like a hippie.
No, definitely not.
Yeah.
But you're starting very well in that corner already, like being in the 1960s, as well as bringing it all over the world. What would, in our terms, in your experience of nearly 50 years of TA, what is your definition of TA for yourself?
Yeah, I knew you were going to ask me that, and I thought, I don't know how to answer that one. I think I would just say it's a psychological a set of psychological frameworks to help people understand what's going on, why it's going on, and so that they can choose the best way to behave or the most appropriate way to behave. So I know in the official descriptions, they talk about the philosophy, and they talk about everybody being okay. But I'm not even convinced that we know what okay is. I was looking up recently because I was teaching about it, and nobody knows where it came from. They think it might be a USA president who was born in somewhere called Old Kinderhook. And his supporters who were trying to get him elected started calling themselves the OK Bunch or something as a code. And Berne talked about it as an attitude. Franklin Ernst, who's much better known and more quoted, talked about it as a behavior. And he came up with this term, the OK-Corral, which is actually the name of a movie about cowboys.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, but that's why it was so gimmicky at the time. But he said it's our behavior, and we might be in any of the four of them. Whereas Berne was saying it's our underlying belief or attitude. And then another colleague of mine, I think they're all dead now, Graham Barnes, suggested that we might have a different one at our feeling level. So I'm thinking that, okay, you might behave like you're okay and other people are okay, but you might behave like you're okay and other people are not. But that might be because you're overcompensating, because you actually believe you're the one who's not okay and they are. And then at a deep feeling level, you might think it's all hopeless and nobody's okay. And you can play around with all those different permutations. And I've now got about 12 different okay variations. So I don't think 4 is enough. So I don't see it as underlying philosophy of TA. I see it as a model within TA that is really useful to think about.
Yeah. And also deep dive into it, like you already said, like look at it from a behavior perspective or from a feeling or perspective, and not everything is black and white. Yeah.
Or an attitude perspective. There was a joke, which sounds a bit horribly like it might be true, that psychotherapists behave like I'm not as okay as my client because I'll still run the session even if I'm not feeling well, because the client has to be the priority. So they behave, I'm not okay, you are. But they do that because their attitude is, this client can't cope without me, so I'm okay, they're not, because they're not as clever as I am. And then at the feeling level, they feel nobody's okay because the clients don't get better and there's always more clients. And I thought that sort of makes sense, really.
Absolutely.
But then we've got things like narcissists think I'm okay and you're irrelevant. So we use a question mark for that. Yeah. And Berne had a question mark in his original material. And then somebody asked me, don't you think there's a position that says I'm irrelevant and you're okay? And the way the person asked it told me it obviously does exist for some people. And then Chinese people told me their one is I'm not okay, but I feel better because my neighbors are more not okay than I am.
Okay, the comparison part.
Yeah. And then a colleague, Tony White, pointed out that those of us who are rich in the TA community must be running, I'm 2 pluses, my colleagues are only 1 plus, because otherwise, why do we give them half our money?
Oh, that's also a very interesting point. Yeah.
So how do we justify the fact that, you know, we're so much better off than other people in other countries?
Yeah.
Unless we believe that their okayness is not quite as good as ours. So I end up with 12 variations.
That's super interesting. And I also like the approach of, even if we start with 4 parts of the coral, that you can evolve it further. This is something in my over 10 years of TA right now. I realized a lot of times that I hit boundaries when I started to further develop models. And they're like, no, it's supposed to be like that. And I'm like, no, like times are changing, people are changing. We need to evolve all of that. And we also need to bring other things into TA that in the beginning weren't part of TA.
Yeah. And I remember a colleague at a conference once who had a great riposte because she was teaching something her way, and a member of the audience said, but Eric Berne said X. And she smiled and said very politely, I think that's your interpretation of what he meant. There are other interpretations. Plus, we need to update things anyway because people don't talk about it enough. But Eric Berne was a person of his time. He was doing this. He died in 1970, sorry. His last book came out 2 years afterwards. But he was only 60. And I'm sure if he'd lived longer, he would have updated himself. But basically, there's lots of evidence that he was homophobic, racist, and sexist because he believed the typical beliefs at that time. So did most psychiatrists.
And it's also interesting if you read his books, the original books, you will find parts where I think like, okay, that's definitely not okay anymore in our time.
I mean, he wrote about a client who was cured because she'd been a happy housewife for 6 months. It's like, you couldn't say that now. He also wrote that gays came out because they wanted to be beaten up.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. Graham Barnes got an Eric Berne Memorial Award for revealing all of that. And there's something about lots of beliefs were also based on what people knew about neurology at that time. So there was this feeling that it's all built in, and something about blaming the parents all the time for what happens. So there's quite a few TA models where I think about maybe it's biological, like the drivers or the working styles, our familiar ways of behaving, where we're under stress, so we do too much of the same style. That's usually looked at as your parents programmed you to be like that. But I suspect it might be biological. So we need to query the theories and not just accept that somebody wrote this years ago.
Yeah.
He said games, Eric Berne said games included wars. Like, what's psychological about a war? They're actually bombing and killing people. So a psychological game means that both the parties or all the parties psychologically are set up to join in. But you can't believe that a whole country is psychologically programmed to join in the same way.
For me, it's always a question of responsibility regarding that, because also, like you said, we can't always blame the parents. They, of course, have a part, but you as a person come into this reality, you live your life, you make your own decision, and also asking yourself the question, what is my responsibility about the decisions that I make? I can't just push them away to someone else, because then autonomy goes down the drain. Because where is my freedom or my understanding of something if I'm not making my own decisions and then also bring up my own responsibility for it?
Yeah, and that's where I think maybe autonomy doesn't really exist as a concept. We like to think we can choose, but so many people don't seem to choose. So when I talk about the life positions, the OK stuff, I call them our windows on the world. It's like we're looking through distorting glass at the world. But then I talk about what would it be at the open window? And maybe the open window is just I am and you are. And even that might not actually be true. So we might be like in that film, The Matrix, we might actually be lying somewhere making electricity for robots to run. And we're imagining all of this. So there's something about being careful that TA doesn't become a religion. It's like if we insist that the real thing is I'm okay, you're okay, how is that any different to saying there is a God or a Buddha or whatever? Yeah, because we don't know.
No, we definitely don't know. But it's fun to think about of all of these things and think of, okay, how do I perceive my reality? And Dr. Ibrahim Karim, he's always saying there's an absolute reality and there's a perceived reality we're having. And we can imagine the absolute reality, but we have no access to it. We can just have our little corner that is our perceived reality, which in TA we probably would call the frame of reference. And this is always like looking from that perspective, like which glasses do I have on, which window, is the window open or is it not open? And am I perceiving that for myself is a really good question. And also bringing up the question of, do we actually have autonomy? Because I always have the question of, I personally do not think there is free will. We have free choice in a specific box where we can do something, but free will is not our level. That's how I perceive it all the time. And that also brings up that question for me. Like, so how, quoting that, real is my autonomy?
Yeah. So going back to the original question about defining what TA is, it's something about, in spite of all of that, there is a whole load of concepts and models that will help us and help anybody else understand the dynamics of what's happening and make some better or more varied choices. So one thing I did pick up, I think probably from NLP rather than TA, is that you should always think about at least 3 options. If you think you've only got one option, it's not going to be true. If you only think about 2, you might as well toss a coin or you get stuck. How do you choose? So to really make a choice, you need to think of at least 3 options, and then you can think about what might happen if each of those is used, and then you make a choice.
I definitely like that, because very often I just try to figure out, it's like, how often do I have 3 things? And this is always my balance. And usually people say like, oh, 2 things are balanced. And I'm like, no, I need a 3rd thing. It's like, so that really fits for me.
Yeah, because I think it's also part of the impact is the process of forcing yourself to think of at least 3 options, rather than just thinking it's either this or that.
Yeah.
So it's actually changing the way you're thinking. And quite often when you think of 3, you realize there's probably 6. But you can carry on then thinking about different options, and then you're really making a choice.
Yeah.
And then I would be saying you make your choice within the context that you're in.
Absolutely.
So I've taken early models about different contexts and thought about them as in terms of there's you on the inside, there's you as you show, there's you interacting with other people like your family, which become your friends. Then there's you interacting with the rest of the street where you grew up, which becomes a bit like when you go off to work. And then there's you in the boundary with your village or city or whatever. And then there's your country, which brings in cultures. But quite often the cultures are different within the country anyway.
Yeah.
So it's something about thinking about which context am I working within the moment. They're a set of circles within circles.
Yeah.
So you're then thinking, what options have I got and which context am I making this decision in? So what you might do at home with your loved ones, you might not do when you're at work or when you're walking down a public street or when you're being a professional in TA, for example.
And that's also a very interesting point, because if we just differentiate I would say now, all the different parts of our personality, it's always, how do I see TA and how is it a support system for me? And knowing, oh God, hey, all of these are parts of myself. And where do I use these parts, or where do I don't use these parts?
Yeah.
I really like that. And it's also one of the things that my clients and my students always give me as a feedback, like that they know, now I know how to act in that environment, or how to not feel, I would say, like I'm not taking it personally anymore. That's one of the things they always give me as a feedback. Like, I realized why this is happening, and that makes it not personal for me anymore. So that's a very supportive help.
Yeah. So it's all part of my version of TA is a bit like Eric Berne was talking about, you teach it to the clients. So I'm thinking, the more we teach it to as many people as possible, they can then analyze what's going on and make their own choices.
Yeah, definitely. And that brings us to the question, how did you get into teaching? Like, what made you teach TA?
Well, I was already teaching when the guy lent me the books. I was in the management training department. So I was training employees and lots of managers. And after I'd read these couple of books, managers would come up to me in coffee breaks and say things like, "You've given me that feedback." We literally counted their sentences and classified them.
Mm-hmm.
So we would be actually telling them, "You said a really lot of negative things about other people," for some of them. And they would come up and say, "You know, that feedback you've given me about in a meeting, I'm doing the same to my kids."
Oh, interesting. So they made
And
that connection already.
yeah, so before I learned the TA, I was stuck because all I could say was, "Yeah, I know, I'm probably ruining my own children's lives as well."
Mm-hmm.
Once I learned about TA, over the coffee break, I would just tell that person, "Well, think about it in these terms." And I would do a very quick teach about ego states.
Mm-hmm.
And I would be saying, you know, you've got this parent that is copies of your parents. And you've got this adult where you can think about what's really happening. And then you've got this child. Inside your child, you've probably got your internal parent telling you you have to behave like this.
Mm-hmm.
And they found it really useful.
Mm-hmm.
And then they started to say in the coffee breaks, "Can you say some more about during the training program?"
Mm-hmm.
So I checked with our training manager and I started put TA into the programs.
Ah,
And
nice.
obviously I did more than just ego states.
Yeah.
So I was already a trainer, but it just seems like such a useful thing because I was running interpersonal skills,
Mm-hmm.
leadership, management, things like that. It seemed a lot more useful to people than telling how to write a report or something.
Yeah, definitely. It's
Yeah,
the same thing that I experienced too when I started in 2012, 13, and then also started to implement TA in my workshops. A lot of people at the end said I should have needed that training 20 years ago. And
yeah,
that is a really great feedback to hear that. Or like half a year ago, I had a group where I had a lot of doctors and PhD people in the group as well. And they're like, okay, we did all of that already. What can you teach us about communication? And I'm like, hold your horses. We're going to do TA. And at the end of the 2 days training, they were like, I didn't expect that, but I actually learned something new. And it's
yeah,
like, this is so cool. Like that they also appreciate. And it's like, okay, I did a lot of communication trainings already, but this is completely new for me.
yeah, yeah. And it's fascinating when I notice how so many people have never come across it,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
even though the TA community seems to be getting bigger and bigger.
Yeah.
It's like, yeah, but we're only a tiny proportion of the world's population.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that all the research says it doesn't matter, for example, what kind of psychotherapy somebody's doing.
Mm-hmm.
They all score about the same in terms of how many of their clients get better,
Ah, okay.
because it's like a third of what matters is your approach,
Mm-hmm.
but a big third is how you create a relationship with the
Mm-hmm.
person you're working with.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you're good at that, it doesn't matter which approach you use. But to me, it makes it so easy for somebody to take it and then carry on using it themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas some other approaches, you're reliant on the practitioner
Yeah.
being there to help you.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas now with TA, you can just read a book and go off and do something.
Yeah. Which is good. I really like that. It's like
Yeah,
I needed for myself a good I always say it's solid training when I started, because I was like, okay, books are not enough. I really want to try it out, because what I always loved about the trainings is that it's not, you have a tiny little part of theory. I do it the same thing, like tiny theory part, but then you always use cases out of the life of the organization or people in their families and stuff. And then you show this is the theory in action. And this is something that I really like, because this is also how you build relationships with the participants, because they know, oh, she's not standing there and just telling me stuff. I can actually bring input into the workshop, and then I have a solution, or I create for myself a solution by working through these theories.
Yeah, and when you mention that, there are, of course, a couple of favorite theories that I've got. So I think the theory about strokes, units of recognition, that everything we do, like you and I are now stroking each other because we're actually interacting. It doesn't have to be saying you're wonderful or you're rubbish. It's anything. And the idea then that we have human needs for contact, which shows up as strokes. It's called strokes, I think, because it's about touching people. I'm realizing this is audio, so showing you me stroking my own arm won't work. But for anybody who's listening, if you think about a baby, the only way it knows you care is you pick it up and basically physically hold it. So that's the basis of calling it a stroke. But then as you get older, they get it through words, they get it through sight, like you smile or you frown. And all children learn that if they don't get enough positive strokes, they can generate negatives. So if you think about a little baby and a little kid sitting there playing with their toys, most grown-ups would not go over and give them a hug and say, oh, I love you, you're such a nice child to have. Most grown-ups think, I've got time to put the kettle on. And the kid thinks, hang on, I'm not getting any strokes in baby talk. So either accidentally or deliberately, they play with something they shouldn't have. At which point the grown-up comes back in and says, put that down, stop playing with that. So all kids learn that if you're short of strokes, do something the grown-ups don't like and you'll get strokes. They're negative, but they're better than nothing.
Exactly.
And then you get to school and the teachers do the same process. They only ever talk to the really clever kids and the really naughty kids. And then you get to work and who do the bosses pay attention to? The top performers and the ones who cause trouble. So knowing about strokes is fantastic, because then you can look at all your relationships and you can look at your own stroking pattern. And then the other favorite topic I've got is called discounting. It's about we don't know what we don't know. And again, it starts off as healthy because you can't pay attention to everything. So, for example, when you talk about teaching people, you hope that they're focused on you and they're ignoring the fact that they need to keep breathing in and out. They're ignoring sounds outside the room. They're ignoring maybe that they need to go and pee or they're hungry. And that keeps us balanced and healthy so we can concentrate on something that we want to. But the problem is that as we're growing up, we learn to discount certain other things because that seems to get us the desired result. So we might discount our ability to feel certain feelings.
Yeah.
Like a typical in most cultures would be girls are allowed to cry, but they're not allowed to get angry.
Mm-hmm.
So they get such a negative response when they get angry that they learn to discount the feelings of anger.
Mm-hmm.
Boys get the opposite. They're allowed to get angry, but they're not allowed to get sad and cry.
Mm-hmm.
So again, when they're older, they're discounting any sensations that would make them show that they're sad. And then there's other ways. One of my colleagues has worked out about 25 different ways that we might be doing this. So we might have learned not to think about certain things or to feel certain things or not to think or feel totally.
Mm-hmm.
But there might be other things that we weren't supposed to be able to do according to the grown-ups.
Mm-hmm.
So we've got ourselves convinced that we actually can't do that. We can't even bring it into our consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of TA is about helping clients and supervisees, for that matter,
Mm-hmm.
to notice what they're discounting.
Yeah.
And just talking to somebody else is a brilliant way of doing that, because you hope they won't discount the same things.
Mm-hmm.
Which is why if you talk to somebody in your own family or your best friend, it won't work, because you're probably running the same patterns.
Mm-hmm.
So ideally, you find somebody as different from you as possible, and then you ask them, help me spot what I'm overlooking.
Yeah.
What am I discounting?
Yeah.
So I think once people understand about discounting and strokes, they've got enough.
Mm-hmm.
The rest of the TA things are really useful, but those would be my two favorites.
Yeah, I like them too. It's like stroking is my favorite thing to work with and teach all the students. And when they realize, they also, I always give homeworks, like have a diagram for strokes for yourself and then also explain it to someone else, and they need to give you feedback on how they perceive you in positive and negative strokes. And one of the things that they always come back with when I tell them, rather having no strokes at all, you go for negative strokes and look at when you're doing that, like not dying of not having strokes at all. I rather create myself a situation where I create a negative stroke to have any stroke at all. And that's just always like mind-blowing to the people. It's like, oh my God, we're doing that. Or
and also keep in mind that you don't have to accept the strokes.
Yes, exactly.
So if somebody's giving you negative strokes because they're in a bad mood, and you know it was nothing to do with you, just let them do it and ignore it.
Definitely. This is like, and also there comes the topic of permission in as well, because because that is already part of the stroke economy of Claude Steiner. And I love that, because especially in Eastern German culture, I see that all the time. And it's like, no, if they have a negative stroke for you, just say, I don't want that negative stroke, flip boing, you can have it back. And they're like, I can do that. And I was like, of course you can do that. It's like permission, protection, potency. This is one of another model that I really love in TA.
Yeah, and actually, it's really permission and protection is Pat Crossman. Steiner added on potency.
Oh, I didn't know that he added on the potency. Okay.
He only added in potency. She'd already written about permission. We're giving people permission to behave differently. And she actually credited her husband for the idea about protection, because he pointed out that if you give a client permission to do something, you should make sure it's safe for them to do it. So as a professional, you should be thinking what protection might be needed.
Yeah.
And I'm not convinced that Steiner actually added much when he said potency, because it's obvious that you need to do those two things potently, but it became a gimmick because it was the 3 Ps. And it's back to the whole idea that I was talking about. You need to think about the context. I remember a colleague writing about his surprise, which I thought shouldn't have been there. He ran an assertiveness training for women. One of the women was Muslim.
Okay.
And she came up at the end of the course and said to him, very interesting, but if I behave the way you've told us on this course, my husband will kill me. So it's like, yeah, where was the protection when you're giving them permission to behave in a different way?
And also to think about that, like we said earlier on, like, okay, my circumstance sense around that, like what can I actually do? And to also know I'm not just getting permission from someone else or a therapist or someone in a training. First of all, I need to give myself permission to do something else. Otherwise, I'm not getting anywhere. That's always what I train my clients and students. But it was really nice. I didn't know that Claude Steiner was in there, because I always say Pat Grossman, the 3 Ps. I didn't even know that there was like a process behind that with other people as well.
She only had the 2. She actually gave the award back because she didn't think it was useful. But I don't know what was happening there, because I still think it's really, really useful.
Absolutely.
But I've seen other colleagues do that. At Graham Barnes, I still use his material, although he says he doesn't think it works, or he said. But I just said, well, I think it works, so I'm going to carry on using it. So
you gave yourself permission to use it.
Yeah. So, yeah. So, but even reading the books is giving people permission, provided they've already got enough permission in their life to think for themselves. But then if somebody is writing the book, they might need to think about, do I need any protection in this book? Like if you wrote a book about assertiveness, you might want to say, don't do this with a really angry person who's holding an axe. Well, as a joke, but, you know, we need to think about what are we sharing? And are we sharing it in a way that implies they ought to do it, rather than giving them permission to consider it?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the cultural concept, I already see it very often here in Germany, if you have clients from Eastern Germany and from Western Germany. And that differentiation should not be there anymore, because it's like 33 years old now that we're one Germany again. But nevertheless, it's always like, wait, you're doing that? And everyone is like looking at each other like, that is just strange. Well, no, I'm not doing that. Or you have a problem with that topic. Why do you have a problem with that topic? So it's so interesting to see still the different cultures.
Yeah, but I think there's something deeper than that. Years ago, I stayed at a boyfriend's house overnight, very proper, separate bedroom and so on. And on the bus home, he told me I'd blown it with his parents. So I'm like, what did I do wrong? Now, 2 things I'd done wrong. When I arrived, I took off my shoes. Now, I was young, and at that time, we all walked around barefoot as much as we could. So I did that outside. I can remember at school doing the long jump barefoot. So I just threw off my shoes and walked around barefoot. And he said that was one of the examples. So I said that none of you were wearing your outdoor shoes. And he said, but we were wearing our slippers. Now, I should have dumped the boyfriend at that point because slippers were for old people. You know, it's like nobody young wears actually slippers. Still, you know, certainly then, grandparents wore slippers. So that was one of the things. Now, we were both white, both English. We live within a few miles of each other, but there's a huge difference in the family culture. And the other thing he said was, when we were getting ready to leave, I shouted up the stairs. I actually realized I'd left my jacket in the bedroom I'd been sleeping in. So I called upstairs, will you bring my jacket down? And I'm like, well, what was wrong with shouting up the stairs? And he said, you should have come up and spoken to me. And I'm like, if I'd come up, I could have got my own jacket.
Exactly.
So completely illogical. But again, in his family, you don't shout up the stairs. You don't shout. So I'm not surprised that there would still be differences between East and Western Germans. There's huge differences even when we think they're the same culture because there are different rules when we're growing up.
So we always need to be aware of, ask for the rules first before you end up.
Check out what culture is the person thinking. And it can be that specific. It's the culture in their family. And might not be the same down the street.
Yeah, definitely. And it's so interesting because it TA in that pattern also makes you aware of, I need to be mindful about what I'm doing and what I think is normal, which is not normal for other humans. I first learned that when I went abroad into other countries, but like you said, you can already have that down the street, that things are different, and that you really are aware of it. Probably I lived through that through my childhood, but I was never aware of it. I was like, oh, everyone is the same. No, they aren't.
Yeah. And we don't necessarily get told that by our parents because unless they've traveled a lot or learnt TA, they assume everybody's the same. Yeah.
And there's so much more, which is a super thing, I think, that makes the world such an interesting place. So, you know, okay, I need to prepare for that, or I need to be aware of that when I travel to another country or to another city, and how are things done there, that keeps you on your toes.
Yeah. And it's also why I get so excited about online, meaning we can have much more cultural cross interaction. Having been to some of the other countries, I've seen how the cultures are different. At different levels, like it keeps raining in the UK, and I'm wondering how long it will take to change our general passing time with people to match that in India. When I first started going to India, which I did several times because I was running quite a lot of training there, I had to learn that you can't start a conversation with somebody by talking about the weather.
Interesting.
Yeah, because the weather never changes. It's either rainy season or it's not. So I would be taken aback because complete strangers would say things like, "Are you married?" And I thought, hang on, complete strangers in the UK say, "What do you think about this rain?" or "The sun is shining." So I realized you can't do that. And now it keeps on raining. So I'm aware that we're now starting to say to people, it's raining again. But it doesn't make any sense to keep saying that. So it's like recognizing silly little things that are cultural differences, and then big things, bigger things, like in Japan, everybody grows up paying attention to the psychological level of the message. In TA, California, it's like you should say what you really mean. If you did that in Japan, they think, what's wrong with you? Because I'm supposed to work out what you really mean.
Yeah.
It means it's such a nice place to be. And I think about getting on a train. In the UK, people are on the platform and the train comes in. The people on the platform push their way onto the train, and the people on the train are struggling to get out, which is a bit daft. In Japan, they politely wait on the platform until the ones who want to get off have got off, and then they get on. And I'm thinking, this is so much nicer as a culture I have. But if I hadn't been there, I wouldn't necessarily have known that. So I'm really excited that the more we can get together online, the more people can learn things and think, okay, maybe our culture could be improved. Like, I still think that boyfriend could have learned that it's fine to shout up the stairs rather than walking up there and doing it yourself, especially as he gets older. Yeah,
Definitely.
Yeah.
It's really, it's very interesting. It's also when I started to travel the world in my 20s, I was like, a lot of countries do things way more efficient than Germans do it, even though we have the stereotype of, oh, we are workaholics, very efficient and stuff. But especially the politeness that you're saying, I also realized that in Singapore, and I was like, wow, we can learn a lot here. And you need to be open for that. And if you have the quality of online trainings, you definitely would have the ability to do that.
Yeah. And also something about the ones who are ready to go online are tending to be the ones with the more open minds.
Yeah, absolutely.
So they'll gain from it a lot. Whereas the other ones who say it's all new stuff and I don't like it, they're closed minds anyway.
Yeah.
Probably even if they traveled somewhere, they just think, oh, that's funny. Why do they do that? Yeah.
Or they expect everything to be like from the place they come from. It's like, okay, the waiter is speaking my language. The rooms will be in a setting that I expected to be in my country and stuff like that. I also know people like that. And I think, like, why are you traveling at all if you expect everything to be like home? Like, that doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah. And then if they stay in the expensive enough hotels, it will be.
Definitely.
So they'll never find out.
Yeah. They do not tap into the real world of that other country.
Yeah. But I'm very conscious that I'm pushing out a technique that was developed in a very specific culture. So it needs a lot of adjustments to work in different cultures. Yeah.
And also the will of the practitioners to open themselves up to let these different things in and say like, okay, this is not working here, but when can we adjust it to see, okay, it's working, but in a different way.
Yeah. And not to say things like, that's what's written and that's how it has to be.
Exactly.
Because even the person who wrote it would probably change their minds if they were still around.
Yeah. I don't know how much Eric Berne traveled and actually tried to see his models also in other regions.
It says he traveled a lot, but I suspect that he traveled and visited other psychiatrists running mental health hospitals.
Yeah.
So I'm imagining it was similar wherever he went.
Yeah.
It doesn't seem as if he ever went and just stayed in some person's home who at least wasn't a psychiatrist. If you think about most countries, you're fairly up there if you're qualified as a psychiatrist.
Yeah, definitely. So creating your own bubble.
Yeah. But also you're in the educated group, the academic group. Yeah.
Most definitely.
So I'm not sure how much he did with mixing with ordinary people, as it were. Yeah.
And it's so important, I think, because when I see who I'm training from all different walks of life and how fast people understand the modules and understand TA, and especially if you work with children, uninteresting from which background, they're like sponges. They're soaking it up and they completely can use it immediately. And it's like, this is fascinating. Like it is something that is for me, always I say it universally available, because it's like if you just use that switch somehow and it's on and they're there and they're capable of using it.
Yeah. And that's why I get really excited. We mentioned websites before we started talking.
Yeah.
And the TA Proficiency Awards website that started by a colleague called Giles Barrow, who was teaching TA to kids. And then we took it and made it more of a scheme. So people in different countries started teaching TA to groups of kids. And then we would give the kids a badge. We still do that, although it stopped for a while during COVID, because obviously you're not going to get little kids online. You needed to wait until they could be back in the room. But we would say, produce some evidence like drawings or something that shows you understand at least 6 different ideas. And then we give them a badge. And everybody does it as a volunteer, and it's spreading it out to kids in lots of places. And then we got parents saying, what are you teaching my kids? So people started teaching groups of parents, and then they started teaching groups of teachers and carers, and it just went on from there. So it's great, because now that hopefully COVID's on the back burner, people can start to get these groups together, and they don't have to be qualified in TA to do the teaching. I picked somebody to assess what's happening who's done at least a couple of years of TA training, so that we can make sure they're not teaching it completely wrong. But that's never happened. And then somebody in Brazil did it a few years ago for unemployed people. Somebody in Turkey does it with coaches. So it's great, but especially because it gets it out to kids. and then hopefully their parents or their teachers. So, yeah.
And that's a great start. Like that would be one of my wishes to actually, when you have a school, that you have one class that is just TA. So you basically learn it from the get-go in the beginning to not work into an organization where you just fall into certain patterns all the time. You have no idea why you have these patterns or why you actually also applied at that company. That is also one thing that I always talk about with my clients. Like, what made you apply to that company, and what is the structure of the company, and what is your structure of behavioral settings, of feelings, of thinking and stuff. And when they made that connection, they're like, oh my goodness, it's obvious why I applied to that company. And then I always ask them, like, okay, would you like to change anything of your behavior pattern, your feelings, your thinking? Would you like to change your job, which could end up like that? And it's super interesting. If we would start with kids, I think we would give them a heads up for the rest of their lives.
Yeah. And then they grow up and be parents who teach their own kids, and they be employees and managers who work in the same way.
Yeah, exactly. The world we would have.
Then you have to be careful. That begins to sound a bit like a religion.
Yeah, there we come back to that topic.
If we could just get everybody to believe in this.
There it's the question of, is it a belief though? Because if they're practicing it and they perceive it as something they try out and they use and they see it works for them, that's a good question. Do I still call it a belief?
It doesn't work, does it? It's only a framework of models to help you understand.
Yeah, exactly.
So you are the one who does something.
Exactly. And it's like the empowerment of, I do not need to go to a teacher, or I do not need to go to a specific organization every once a week or something, and still get my life in a track that I maybe wanted to, and change something about my life. And I think that for me, that is the thing that I really like about TA, that I don't need to come together with everyone else. I can build myself a TA community, but I don't have to. I can still practice it and live it and try to implement it in my daily life.
Yeah. So, in terms of spreading it around, I've already mentioned I've set up the World Online TA Association.
Tell us more about it.
Well, I set it up probably a couple of years ago. It's still quite small because I must admit I've been busy, so I haven't publicized it as much as I could have done. But the whole idea is anybody can join it. The membership fee is, if possible, the price of a cup of coffee in your own country. Some associations already made a donation for their members. And if somebody couldn't afford to make a donation, we won't stop them joining. And we just need enough money to pay for the website, basically. I'm soon going to start a newsletter because we haven't done that. And also, I've been interviewed like this by a guy in Iran. And there's interviews on the website, and he's going to do another one soon. And we're looking at whether we could organize an online conference at some point. But basically, it's closed in terms of the member list. You can only see the member list if you're a member. But then it's got other pages where people can put their programs, their groups, whatever they're doing, so that anybody can see all of that. And it's also all run on, if you can afford to pay something, make a donation towards that cost.
So everyone who's joining in is also like asked to actively do something like starting a group or
No,
doing something?
no, they can just be a member.
Mm-hmm.
It's only that if they are running a group, for example, at the moment, there's a group running in Iran in Persian.
Mm-hmm.
So that's publicized on. So somebody could see those details without being a member.
Mm-hmm.
And then somebody in Ireland is running another group, and somebody in another country is looking at doing that. And there are various trainers running training programs, like your program could be on there.
Yeah.
So my idea is that gradually we'll get more and more information, and it will become the focal point. If you want to be online and you want to be international,
Yeah,
that's the association.
I really like the idea because that's one thing that I kind of miss in Germany, that we do not have a real good TA community. And I started to start a group, and it just started to fade away again because meeting regularly is not what people want, or the topics aren't fitting and stuff like that. And if you can do it globally and you just bring people together who are interested in meeting up and maybe working on some cases or stuff.
Yeah, and it shows the languages. So if somebody can only speak one language, fine, they can find other people who speak the same language. And of course, there is a big association in Germany, DGTA, that's affiliated to the European Association. But the European Association doesn't seem to like online.
Okay. I didn't know that. It's like,
yeah, they've just issued a new handbook that says, it's very confusing because when you read the handbook, it says one thing, but they've issued an announcement that says something slightly different.
Okay.
But basically what they're saying is, if you want to qualify professionally, there is a limit on how much you can talk to your supervisor or your sponsor online. You've got to see them face to face.
Okay, I didn't know that. Fascinating.
By a certain number of hours.
Yeah.
Which means that, I've got people in Eastern Europe, we can't do that. So that means they can't qualify because there's nobody in their country, even if they could afford to travel to somewhere else in the country. So it's like putting it back to when I first learned, and I had to fly to another country one weekend of every month for about 4 years.
It's like, I always have the experience, these organizations have the tendency to shoot themselves in the foot.
I know.
And the question is, I have no idea what added value they want to create out of that, but they do not create any added value.
Well, it's something about believing that online does not have the same impact as on site. But there's loads of evidence that it does.
Yeah. So
it's weird. So I can see that being a problem anyway. So basically, I'm hoping my alternative will become more popular, because it's also, I set up another website, which you've all got a note of, the International Centre for TA Qualifications. So I'm offering qualifications that you can do online. Yeah. So I'm not insisting that you've got to have your client sitting in the same room as you. I'm not insisting you've got to work with a group if you only ever work one-to-one. I'm not insisting that you've got to work one-to-one if you only ever run groups. I'm not insisting, and my colleagues who are associated with it, are not insisting that you have to specify whether you're organizational, educational, counseling, or psychotherapy. I'm not insisting that if you're a coach, you have to pretend you're doing counseling. So I'm just saying, basically, we use TA in psychotherapy to cure people, or we use it other ways to develop or to help people develop themselves or to help them cure themselves. And within that, you can choose your own title, which is what I was allowed to do when I first ever qualified in TA. I wasn't a psychotherapist, so I was allowed to choose my own title. I lost it after a few years because they then announced that it has to be one of these labels. And that was weird because I ended up saying, I'll call it organizational. I years later learned that somebody else who did the same thing got labeled as educational. So it's weird. So I'm just thinking, why can't you just describe your own professional work and get something that says other advanced practitioners have looked at what you're doing and we think you're doing that competently.
And it's also interesting because it also takes away the ability and the trust in the clients, because the clients find you some way or another. If it's just mouth by mouth or anything else, or organizations handing you over to another organization, and they absolutely do not care about your title. They just care about how well you work with the employees or with the people and stuff like that. And so I very early on stepped away from all the organizational things, thinking, I don't need these certifications, and nobody from my clients that I know these organizations anyway. They're like, so if you're part of that organization or not, we don't care, Dagmar. We want you to come, do the training, work with our employees.
And I always tell people the only good reason to do a TA qualification is your satisfaction that your colleagues have checked what you're doing and they say you're competent. So governments don't recognize it. You need it anywhere. Some countries have somehow got it established, especially for psychotherapy. But most places, it doesn't give you anything extra. So if you really want a qualification, if you really believe that people are looking for that, do a master's. Because it's at the same level. In what I offer, we offer an optional master's, but that costs a lot more money because we have to pay a UK university. Whereas the rest of us work a system of discounts.
Oh yeah, tell me more about the discounts, because you did that over companies, over countries, and different selling opportunities.
What I do now is I use numbeo.com, which is a website. Every 6 months, they publish the relative purchasing power in different countries. So I just look at that every 6 months and then round it down to the nearest 5%. So then I publish my training courses, programs, and when we invoice somebody, unless they've told us they've got enough money to pay the UK fees, we automatically give them the discount for the country. And it varies between, it's like, I remember there was somewhere like, if you're in Venezuela, you get 85% off. If you're in New Zealand, you don't get anything off. So if you're in Qatar, you don't get anything off. So in China, you get 40% off my fees. Croatia, you get 40%. So I adjust the fees to recognize the purchasing power. Now, when I was ITAA president, and before that, IATA president, the European and International Associations, some colleagues, Jenny Hine and Mervyn Hine, said to me, we should be giving discounts. And I thought that's a really good idea. So we put together a proposal. We called it the talent because it was TA length and it meant a money. And I pushed that through as president that both of those associations would operate a discount system. Over the years, it became more like they grouped it too much, I think. But they're still doing that scheme that I introduced. They still do give discounts depending on where in the world you are.
Yeah.
But I don't know how many other trainers do that for their training. Also, when I do supervision, I don't set a fee for that. In group supervision, I have a fee and we apply the Numbeo discounts. But if I'm working one-to-one, what I say is, you tell me your average income per hour, and I will add 50% to that when I supervise your work. So again, it means that what I'm charging people is always in line with the purchasing power in the country they're in.
Yeah. And that's a really good thing. It's like I didn't think about that because I do not have so many international differences. But if you would apply to your get onto your homepage and be part of it of the World Online Transaction Analysis Association, that you can actually do that and then also provide TA for the rest of the world and say like, okay, you not just did something good, you also educated people and they can also educate other people.
We would expect that if somebody wants to advertise through the website, they're going to do that. Because it would be a waste of time otherwise. Because if you want to charge the fees of the country you're in, nobody else is going to come if they're in a poorer country. And it's all part of being a world online TA association.
And how many participants do you have right now? Do you have a number that we can just already think about the size?
Do you mean a number of
members or people who participate on it?
I think it's fairly small still. It's about 120 or something like that. So hopefully we're just closing down another association that I've been heavily involved in, the Institute for Developmental TA.
Okay.
Which I started with a couple of colleagues back in 2003, because we were fed up with being ignored by psychotherapists, because most TA associations are full of psychotherapists. So we set up our own and we affiliated to the European Association. Eventually, when ITAA did partner organizations, we joined as that. But we've had various difficulties in the dynamics. So we've decided to close down and put our energy into the world online instead. So within a month or so, I'm going to start really pushing it out. This is quite useful because some of the people who listen to that might like to join a world online one. Especially if they're listening to things like this online, rather than expecting to go somewhere and sit in a room to listen to us talking.
Definitely. And it's also for me, it's so important to cater to all of the target groups, because I also have a new group. They always wanted everything in person, and I'm like, okay, I can do that. I have an office space, so I can do that. But also, I really love to work online because you can still make a great training. It's for me not a difference at all. And if people are open to that and want to join, it's definitely welcome.
Yeah, and I've still got one or two who were talking about face-to-face. And I'm still thinking about whether I do that. I've got a separate building that I used to use to run my training courses before COVID. That all stopped, obviously, because of COVID. And I actually hosted a group of 5 Ukrainian refugees in there for a while.
Yeah.
They've moved on, so I've now got the space back. But I'm still thinking, you know, I know it would be nice, but it would only be the ones who can afford to come here. So there won't be anybody from countries where they're not allowed out or where they can't afford to do that. So I can't make up my mind whether I want to do that or not. I'd have to have a lot of people nagging me and convincing me, but I could do that.
Yeah.
But it just seems like it's so much more fun and useful to do it online.
Yeah. I also was thinking about like, oh, when I start that and provide it in my office, is that a step back for me? That was a thought that I had because I was like, okay, if everyone is knowing, okay, she's doing it in the office again, so maybe everyone wants to flood into my office again. Not a problem from the logistics and everything possible, but it's like the freedom also that I experienced with the online workshops of I actually do have a break when we have a break because everyone is going to the bathroom and everything. And if you're in the office, you never have a break as a trainer. And it's just, I was like, it is so quiet right now and everything. I was really enjoying that.
Yeah, but for me, it's more about who can afford it and who's allowed to do it. So, you know, somebody's not going to come here from Iran.
No.
And at the moment, somebody in Russia can't be allowed to pay me.
Yeah.
So they certainly couldn't come here. So it's like, oh, it's something about, I talk about personal, I forgot the words, but it's something about the privilege of being able to be there personally.
Yeah.
So many people don't have that privilege. So every time we use it, are we reinforcing that other people don't have it?
Yeah. That is also a good line of thinking.
Yeah.
I always, for myself, also thought it is a compliment to me and my work that people are willing to sit in a car for 1, 2, or 3 hours and get to my office. But I was like, is it necessary? For me, it was always the point of it is not necessary. We could do anything online, or we can do it if it's a single session one-on-one, we can do it on the phone. Because I'm really drilled on voices and frequencies. And for me, it's like, I get more out of the session sometimes doing it online than having the person in person sitting in front of me and I have the body and everything where I know, okay, I'm watching that right now. I should just listen to what the person is actually saying. So I was like, I think I need to deliver on both tracks. That's how I see myself in the next 2 to 3 years.
Yeah, but there's something about TA is largely auditory. So lots of the models, you can use them by analyzing what people say and how they say it.
Yeah.
So I can understand if I was doing some kind of somatic therapy, I would need to see the person in front of me because I need to see their foot is tapping and so on. Although I think even that is not beyond online. You just say, move the camera further away so I can see all of you.
Yeah.
The other thing I'm aware of is I'm not very visual. I think it might be because I was short-sighted when I was little and nobody knew. So I've never learned the fact of somebody's face. I can't imagine their face if it's not in front of me. So I'm aware that online, your face is in front of me, so I'm looking at it. Whereas if you're in a room with me, I might not be looking so closely at your face anyway. So I'm much more interested in what you say, how you say it, your tone, and how you put the words together. And people talk about it's no good about feelings, but then we all know that trolling has a huge impact on people. You don't have to be there. If you say something nasty enough, they get upset. So I think the feelings still come through.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. But basically, it's the personal presence privilege. That's what I call it. Personal presence privilege. If you run it on site, you are leaving out the ones who can't afford to get there or are not allowed to switch countries.
Yeah.
And I'm very aware that I would never have learnt my TA if the airline hadn't paid for me, because I couldn't have afforded it. I was a single parent with 2 small boys.
Yeah.
There's no way I could have afforded to keep going to Scotland every month. So I would never have done it.
Yeah. And it's definitely also, I see that in Germany too, like you have specific prices, and if you look at institutions, how the prices are different, but also like what is affordable also for Germans. And then when you say, okay, I do it online, I do it worldwide, and then also put a number-based system on it. And to think about that, I think a lot of trainers that I know never thought about that system. So for me, it's also a good opportunity to bring that out right now and make them see, okay, who can you like support to a certain degree? You will run the training anyway, and how much money do you need for that training? And then how many spots can you give out or hand out to other people who are not able to pay the whole amount?
Yeah, or put your fees up so that you can afford to give the discounts and still get the income you need.
Yeah.
When I do supervision, I make it very clear I've got some people who earn a considerable amount. Organizational people tend to, especially if they're freelance. So I'm very open and honest about they're paying for the others. Because when they tell me what they earn, I'm thinking, wow, that would be more than somebody would earn in the UK.
Yeah.
But I'll take it because it helps to balance out with the ones who can't afford that.
Yeah.
And it also helps to balance out the free ones, because 50% added on to 0 is still 0.
Exactly.
So if somebody doesn't have a job or an income and they're doing a placement or something, they don't pay for their supervision.
And that's really a good opportunity, like also to know, because a lot of people may not ask. Like, I need to ask my students all the time, like, so is it possible for you after one of the modules that you pay? And some of my clients even said, oh, I don't need to pay the whole entire year beforehand. And I'm like, no, this is, everyone has completely different thoughts about how is the payment going down.
I've never done that about signing up for the whole year. It's crazy because it knocks out so many people.
Yeah. But it's also a commitment thing.
Yeah, but it also would knock out anybody who's logical.
Okay.
Because if you sign up for a year, you could die halfway through that year. So you have to be so illogical to assume that you'll stay alive and healthy and nothing else will happen in your family or your friends that might mean that's more important than coming on a TA training course.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's illogical to say, I know I'm going to be there for the
That's
year.
very interesting because I'm doing that for three years now, and the majority of my clients or students, they actually want to sign up immediately for the entire 2 years that I'm offering. And I'm always saying, no, you get a 1 year contract. And I also, when I see, okay, some problems are arising, I definitely make everything happen. But it's like, it's very interesting. It's like, oh no, the first module was already so great. I would immediately sign up for the second year. And like,
Yeah.
no, maybe you want to have a break in between, take your time, let everything sink in. So maybe I have unlogical students. No.
And I think you can have a contract that says, I want to get the qualification, and you might decide how long that lasts. Like I've got a contract for a qualification that might take 1 year if somebody was able to do everything they need to. But I would typically spread it over 3 years and make it very clear that you can just sign another one afterwards until you've finished. But I wouldn't want somebody to say, I will attend everything and I will pay for everything. Because otherwise, they end up asking permission to not come.
Yeah.
Or they end up feeling like a failure because they didn't make it to all of them. Which, if they've already got a script that says they're going to be a failure, you've fed into it.
Yeah. Reinforcing it. It's very interesting because no, right now the first 3 groups that I had, everything worked out perfectly. Sometimes we needed to switch dates, but then they just approach me and say like, "Oh, can we change the dates?" And I'm like, "Yeah, of course." Then I send something around for all the participants. So there's not so much lack of not attending, and it's in 1 year it's 6 modules, and every module is 2 days. So that's doable.
Yeah, unless somebody was dying in their family.
Exactly. And that is definitely that's a thing I never thought about. It's like, but I would definitely have a workaround for that because it can happen. And then it's like if you don't attend my trainings, I also don't want to charge you because then it's like I didn't work for you. That it's a strange feeling. I also don't do that with my organizational clients.
Yeah. So an organizational clients is another
That's a whole different
because
absolutely.
I used to do that and I soon learned that whatever you put in the contract, they won't pay you if they decide they don't want it anymore.
Okay.
So I would have these nice legal contracts and kid myself that that's fine. And then the management changed at a company and they didn't want what I was doing. So they just said, forget it. And I remember there were 4 consultancies working with this big company and they scrubbed all of us. The biggest one was in really fast and they actually got the cancellation fee that is in the contract.
Yeah.
And the other 3 were smaller, including mine. And the attitude was, get lost. You can't afford lawyers to fight us in court. And I remember that somebody in the big company fed me some information. So I threatened this company with that and they paid me, but only if I promised not to tell anybody else they paid me. But that was my introduction to, big companies, big organizations don't care what they've signed. They just care what they can get away with.
That's fascinating. I never had that experience with an organization. I have a lot of funky experience with organization because it's a whole different tier. It's like, whatever is happening here. And you can hide behind a lot of organizational structures, definitely.
Yeah. So it's always a multi-party contract.
Yeah, always.
And you can't rely on the personnel not changing. So even if you think you've got a really good relationship with whoever signed the contract on behalf of the organization, they could be gone.
Definitely.
And somebody else doesn't think it matters.
Yeah.
So you could go to court, but that would probably cost you more than the fees you're going to get.
Yeah. You need to reevaluate what is the most important to you. But it also can be a resource, because what I experience is when the people I worked in HR change organization, they have the tendency to take me with them. And that is really like, okay, I'm getting a new client, and I was not asking for it, but they're like, no, you're doing that so well. I want you in that organization too.
Sure. I also learned not to coach HR people.
Yeah, important.
Because I was coaching somebody, and then she said, I'd like you to come into our company and do consultancy work. And I'm like, I can't do that because I can never be 100% sure that you haven't got into some kind of symbiosis with me.
Exactly.
We solved that one by, she was actually thinking she might leave anyway. And we then ended up with me contracting with her boss completely separately and cutting her out of it. Yeah. But after that, I thought, no, I don't want to coach any HR directors if I might want to work in that company.
In the organization. That is also one thing I very often experience in the TA concept and context of organizations, that they don't understand that. When I explain that to them, it's like, we can't do that, or I'm not coaching over specific hierarchical levels, because that's a breach of trust. If I work with your employees and then I have the executive board or this and that, we need to be very careful. We need to have another consultant or coach in there. And they're like, why can't you do all of it? It's like, it's not working like that.
Yeah. And that's a good example of where I talk about the different fields of TA. Psychotherapists tend to think they're doing the real TA and it's easier for other people, but they never have to work with contracts like that.
Yeah.
So the multi-party contract stuff comes up so much more with developmental TA, especially when you're working with organizations and schools.
Yeah.
It's quite skillful to juggle all of that.
Definitely. Yeah. And it's like, whatever Vanita English put up for that structure, I was like, I was breathing it in when I started TA, because it was so helpful to me. And also to know how you fall from a multi-level contract into maybe a drama triangle if you do not do it correctly. It's just so understandable.
Yeah. And what Nellie Michaud added about psychological distance. So actually drawing the triangle to show that some of the parties are too close to each other.
Yeah.
Yeah, is really helpful. Like, you get too close to the management and the employees feel they're at the sharp pointed end. You get too close to the employees that you're working with and you forget that the organization is paying the bill.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So it's really have an ethical understanding about what you're doing and communicate it to the organization and the different levels as well. Very important.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Another question I have for you is about your research journal. I really enjoyed that. I stumbled over it by accident years ago. And every time I get an email, because it's also for free. And how did you come up with that and everything around that?
It was IATA. It was the European TA Association set it up. The first issue came out in 2010, and I was invited to be the editor.
Yeah.
And they funded it for a few years. And then it got very difficult because it was set up just to talk about research, but there was always a struggle to get enough content about research and TA. So in 2012, I agreed with the president at the time. We did a joint proposal to include practice as well, to include not just research. Now, I went to the council meeting as a guest because I was the editor, and as far as I'm concerned, they approved it. And then for the next few years, I managed to get enough content so I didn't do anything about officially changing it. And then somebody worked with the Transactional Analysis Journal, which was the existing one that's been going for years, with the International TA Association, which is only available to members or through. So the TAJ, the journal by the ITAA, is only for their members or through a library, academic library. But they decided to run a special issue on research, which is fascinating because I didn't get any articles because everybody sent them to that. So I thought, I've got nothing to publish, so I'll finally implement what the council said I could do in 2012, 5 years ago, and I stuck practice on the end. Now, my line manager was the president of IATA, so I told him at the beginning of the year that's what I was going to do. The only feedback I got was they didn't like practice because they thought it stood for psychotherapy.
Okay.
So I said, there are loads of journals called research and practice, so I can't think of another word. So I did it, and then somebody complained about it, and he actually denied they'd approved it. And I ended up in a process where somebody said in 2012 it never got minuted. So I had the proposal, I had the agenda, I had my own notes of the meeting. Of course, I hadn't seen the minutes of the meeting because I wasn't part of the council.
Yeah.
But they said it never got minuted. The president who'd done the proposal with me said she couldn't remember anything about it. So they more or less said I shouldn't have done it. So I said, in that case, you know, I'll stop being the editor, appoint another one. Months went by and they hadn't appointed another one. So I just said, being me, fine, I'll publish it myself. So after 2017, I just ran it myself. And I've done it ever since. And they covered the costs for the first 7 years. And it was free to everyone. And I thought, well, I'm not going to change that. So I just pay for it myself, or I get occasional donations. A couple of authors have made reasonably good donations, like $1,000 or $2,000 just once when they were being published. Sometimes people give a small donation. I used to pay somebody to do the IT, and now I do it myself, which is a bit of a stretch. But I just think there's no point in me making people pay for it, because that will make it like the other journal where you can't read what's in it unless you can afford to pay.
Yeah. And who's coming in to apply? I will call it apply to have their research public. Like who is finding you and who's applying?
Well, it's TA people who write something, but because there's not a lot of research, there is some research. I get that, but I also get practice articles. Yeah, so anybody can look at it and see who the authors have been. And I'm now working on the next issue, which is due out about June, July. I'm getting enough through. And then I do 2 issues a year because I'm not getting loads of articles. Obviously, most of the TA people send their stuff to the ITAA, and it ends up in the TAJ.
Yeah.
But I don't think they understand that it's a problem. I had articles published in the TAJ. 1 year, I wrote about the TA Proficiency Awards with a co-author. We wrote an article about this social action, all run by volunteers. And we had this article published a few years back. And then I noticed in the thing I'd signed, it said there were limits on how many copies I could give out of my article. And I couldn't put it on a website without permission from the publisher.
Okay.
So the publisher was then Sage. It's now Taylor and Francis. But they would make the same because I tried something else. I wrote in and said, we've got a website for this initiative. It's all social action. It's all voluntary. Can I put it on the website? And they said, yes, for $2,500 a year. So I wrote and made the point, it's all voluntary. There is no money. And they said, we'll give you a special deal, only $1,500 a year. So I could never do it. So I thought, I'm not writing for them anymore because I can't share the information unless somebody can afford to either join the ITA, or if they're academic, if they work in a university, they'll have it. And then when it became Taylor and Francis, I found an article published in 1980 or something, years ago, in some journal that had gone out of business. But it was really useful, and the author would love me to put it in the journal I run. So the old journal had been taken over by Taylor and Francis. So I wrote and said, can I do it? Same answer, no. Not unless you pay for it.
Yeah.
So it's like, I can understand they're big publishers. They need people to keep on paying. But I don't understand why my colleagues prefer to write for something that can only be read. ITA has only got about 1,200 members.
Yeah. And it's so interesting when I listen to you right now, I just realize you need to decide what kind of content creator you want to be. Like the one for a tiny, tiny, tiny group, or like what we are doing right now to have the ability to invite everyone who wants to listen or who wants to read.
Yeah, I know. And I've tried to get in some of the main databases, like journals do. But I've realized that they're probably run by groups of publishers, because when I put our application in, they respond by saying, you're too specialized and it's not interesting enough. But I'm like, but they've got the TAJ listed. So it's the same topics. So how can they say this content is not interesting enough?
Yeah.
But we're self-published.
Yeah. I see you always create a workaround. I like that about you. It's really like, if there's anything in the way, I just find another way.
Yeah. Yeah. It means I'm regarded as a deviant. There's an article in the latest TAJ by a guy called Alice Zivkovic, who's not written about TA, actually. It's fascinating. It's non-TA stuff, but it's all about how groups need a deviant so that they can feel they're a closer group. So I'm a deviant. I read it and I thought, oh, he could be writing about me. I do these things, I think, in spite of whatever the organization wants to do. I'll find a way around it.
Yeah. And it also works, you know, like you build up your own groups, you build up your own communities, you inspire other trainers and other people to do the same or think around another corner that they may have never seen before, never see before. And that is really cool.
Yeah.
So what is up for you in the future? Like, what is your thing that you're planning for the next 1 or 2?
I knew you were going to ask me that, and I've scribbled down death with a smiley face, because I'm 80. I tried to retire when I was 65. I moved to a new home, prompted by one of my sons, and we refurbished it, and I finished all that. I'd stopped working for about a year, and then I was sitting outside one day feeding the duck and the ducklings by hand. I managed to train them to come up and eat out of my hand, and I thought, I'll get Alzheimer's if I don't do something with my brain. So I came back out of retirement, and I'm loving it still, but I think, well, I'll just carry on what I'm doing until I drop dead. Now, my mother was 98 when she died, so I figure I might last until 104.
So a lot more stretches.
Only went mental in the last few months, which was actually quite amusing. I mean, it was not really sad because she didn't know she'd gone nuts.
Yeah.
She would suddenly tell us, my uncle came to live with me when his partner died, and she would suddenly tell us, I remember over lunch, she said, I've got married again. And she claimed she didn't tell us, she didn't invite us to the wedding because she didn't know our addresses. The three of us lived together. So it's like, okay, fine, if that's what she thinks. So hopefully I won't go like that until a few years' time. So I'll just keep on doing what I'm doing.
And that's great. I really like that. And as long as you enjoy it, it's the best thing.
Yeah, it does. And other than that, I've got great-grandchildren. So I spend time with grandchildren and great-grandchildren. I've just acquired another puppy that's rescued from somewhere. So I'm really feeling my age when it wants to run about. I do knitting and I watch stupid TV programs about people being killed and caught by the police.
The murder mysteries.
Yeah, more the special victims unit and stuff like that, old ones where the good guys always win and they all catch the crooks, but it's completely brainless. As a change from thinking about other things. And then I'm producing all these free books.
Yeah.
And I'm also setting them up myself and working my way through Amazon and publishing them. So I'm learning my IT skills at the same time.
And that's so good.
I had somebody who was doing that for me, but now I'm doing it myself.
And it's also getting easier and easier. I also went to Amazon and it's like, okay, how can I publish that? And how can I publish that? It's like, it's really easy now. It's really, really easy now.
It is really easy. And also I'm publishing them free. So I've managed to set it up so that Amazon covers their own production costs and postage costs. That's all. So I can't avoid that. I can't expect them to produce a paperback for nothing. But I also offer it as a PDF and an EPUB because that can be completely free.
Yeah. I will definitely also link that below in the description.
Yeah, fine. And I've got links where they can just get into my Dropbox and pick them up. And I've got links about the drafts because I've been writing these over the years because they were my handout booklets for my training. So I'm now pulling them all together, updating them. They're getting a lot bigger than they used to be, which is quite interesting. And then I'm thinking when I get to the end, which I should do this summer, then I'll be into second editions, won't I?
Whoa,
because
nice.
I keep reading stuff and thinking, oh, that's really interesting. I need to add that in.
Definitely. Yeah. And it's really good. I looked at the 3 books. I haven't read all of them, but particular things I already took out, and it's like, oh, this is so good combination of everything. Like you looked at everything from different angles. And it's like, oh, this is so helpful also for me and my training groups.
Yeah.
So thank you very much for that.
Yeah, there's 4 out at the moment. And then I've got loads of them piled up behind me to finish them off. But I keep reading another article and thinking I should put that in. So at some point I have to say, that's it. It has to go through. But there'll be a whole series of them coming out and they're in the drafts at the moment if somebody's desperate to look at them.
Yeah.
And I've really enjoyed it. And it's also clearing up my office because I've got all these folders with all these articles in.
That is pretty amazing. Do you have any other recommendations of books that you maybe over the years really started to enjoy and say, like, these are books that I can refer?
Not really. It's more about any of the ones I'm summarizing, if somebody is really serious, especially if they want to become a teacher and supervising TA, they ought to read the original books, but they're all in the references. But there's nothing in particular that I would be saying, oh, you need to read this one. Like we started off, I read I'm Okay, You're Okay. But you need to realize it's very different to what Berne was saying. So you really need to read Berne, and then you need to read my stuff based on Tony White's and other people's stuff to say, but we don't even know what okay means. So it's like any one book will only give you one perspective.
Exactly. So it's definitely, that's always what I tell my students as well. Take different authors and look at how they look at specific modules to create also your own perspective, because you need to think on your own.
Yeah. So, yeah, it's difficult to recommend something without somebody, me knowing what they need. If they're studying TA as a potential practitioner, they need to read as many of them as they can. The idea I'm doing the free books are reviews and critiques. So every so often I do remind people that when you get interested in something I've written about, go back to the originals. Don't just trust my perception or your understanding of what I mean, because that might not even be accurate.
Yeah.
It's a bit like I said with a colleague saying that's your interpretation of what Berne wrote.
Yeah.
So other people will be interpreting what I've written, and I'm interpreting what somebody else has written. So go back and have a look at it.
Yeah. And
if you can.
Keep an open mind. Exactly.
Yeah.
Very nice. So my final question to you is, what is your gift to the world?
I don't know. I wrote down nothing, same as I wrote down death, because I don't think I've given a gift to the world. I've just been here and been alive and done what I like to do. So I wasn't doing it to give a gift to the world. My script story in TA is I'm Robin Hood. So I help the peasants deal with the sheriffs of Nottingham. So I found ways of making TA available to the peasants who can't afford to pay all that money to get involved. But I didn't do that for them. I did it because that's what I like doing. And I'm also very aware culturally that I was really lucky where I was born. I often talk to people about we don't have volcanoes, we don't have earthquakes, we don't have governments that just lock us up. We don't have people who stop us leaving. So I'm really lucky. So I've just enjoyed it, and then I'll be dead.
In between so many good things that you put in place, and also for everyone else to follow on when you finally finished your life.
Yeah, and then there'll be some who'll be really pleased I've gone because I've annoyed them a lot. And there will be some who will think, oh, that was useful. That's a shame she's not writing anymore. Yeah.
That is really nice.
Yeah. So I'm going to have a green burial.
Oh, so you thought about that already too? Nice.
Yes, I've got that all planned. My sons know that there are certain cemeteries in the UK. They put you in egg box material, you know, like recyclable stuff, and they just put you in the ground. So my body is left to science. So eventually they'll get the bits back that nobody wants to play with in a laboratory, or probably it's all too old to put it into somebody else anyway. They'll get all the bits, they put it in a cardboard box, and they put it in the ground. And they can plant a tree over it. And in the Robin Hood story, I remember he dies of old age. First of all, I remembered he died young. And then I thought with TA, that's a really bad life story. So I remembered a different ending. But he fires an arrow out of the window. So I do accept that I can't do that bit, because even if I had a bow and arrow, there's no way I could fire it from this house to where the nearest green cemetery is.
Yeah.
But I can get the rest of it. They can put me in the ground and plant a tree.
That was so beautiful.
Yeah. And at one level, one of my sons has already done the tree planting, because he bought somewhere and planted 2,000 trees. So, but I don't think he'd be allowed to put me in his grounds. I think
in between the 2,000 trees.
No, I think it has to be. They don't even let you bury your dogs here.
No, you need permission for everything in spaces.
Yeah, they stopped saying you can bury your dog in the garden. It's like, what's wrong with that? We always used to do it. So, yeah, so my gift to the world is just nothing, because I've just been here and enjoyed myself.
But that's also a great gift, just enjoying life and doing whatever you enjoyed doing.
Yeah, but also recognizing I've been lucky where I was born.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't want that to be something that people in other countries think they're supposed to be thinking they're lucky, and because they're not. They're unlucky that they were born where they were when they were born. Yeah.
So we both got lucky where we were born to do also the things that we love to do.
Yeah. And I was even lucky enough, I was born during the Second World War. And my father lived through, although most of his regiment did not. So that's also intriguing, because I could have been killed.
Yeah. And the thing is, the world needed you, all your books and all the effort you put in. So now we can make use of that.
Or it was just a fluke.
No, the universe always has a plan.
I think, that gets religious though. I think you need to recognize that universe doesn't have a plan. It's all luck. And it might not be really happening. And if it is, I'm going to heaven, because I'll make this the last thing. Do you know the story about the man who died, and he's walking along, and his dead dog appears by his side.
Yeah.
And they get to this place that says it's heaven. So he goes to go in, and he says, I'm really thirsty. And they say, there's a water fountain. And he says, have you got a bowl for the dog? And they say, we don't allow dogs in. So he comes out, because he's not going to heaven without his dog. They carry on walking, and they come to this beat up old place. And they've got a fountain for him, and they've got a bowl for the dog. So they both have a drink. And he says something to them about, why does you not say this is heaven? Why do you allow that other lot to say they're heaven when you really are? And the person in heaven says, that's fine. They weed out the ones who would leave their best friend behind.
Oh, that's nice.
Yeah. So if there is a heaven, I'm going, because I keep rescuing dogs. Yeah.
I love that. I really love that. Thank you so much for your time and for answering all the questions.
Okay, thank you. I've really enjoyed this.